Productive Pastor 84, the best things I've learned this year. What's going on, friends? Chad Brooks back with Productive Pastor, another episode 84, coming a day late, but hey, y'all, the episode's out. Finished up my last work trip of the year. Excited to get back in front of you. I'm going to talk about the best things I've learned this year. And this is why this kind of hits for me. One of the things I've learned, it's not on the list, but it's one of the things I've learned over the last year or so is there is something about realizing that we have to grow our capacity. Now, this doesn't mean our ability or our superstar, nothing like that. What it means is us saying, there's some ways that I need to grow in my ability to do certain aspects of ministry well, and the belief that that growth can happen. And so a lot of these really are about my own findings of that bigger idea this year and how they're affecting things. So I'm excited to share these things with you. We're going to be doing a lot of year-end wrap-ups for the rest of the year with the podcast. And this is the first one I want to share with you. The best things I've learned this year, how they hopefully have made me a better pastor, a better ministry leader, a better person who serves tons of pastors and tons of churches in my vocational ministry, and also who's able to drill down in a unique ministry context myself. So let's just kind of go straight on into it. The three things I have learned this year. Now, hopefully I've learned more than just three things this year. I like to think I have, but if I consolidate things down into what's most important, but also consolidate down into what has affected things the most, and then how these things are pushing me into 2024, I feel like these three things sum up the majority of that. So let me share them with you. Number one, it's iteration. Now, that's a hot word. That's a buzzword. My wife, who works in the corporate world, says that word is very much overused and passé. Well, it's defining a lot of the things I have learned over the last 6 months. Because let me ask you this. How many times have you done something and it's not worked nearly as well as you thought it would, and you decide to quit doing it? Now, here's the problem. Sometimes your gut instincts might have been right. The learning that you had to do was realizing that there was a gap between your gut instincts and this projected future and the application in the middle of it. I talk about Daniel M's book, No Silver Bullets, all the time on the podcast, also in coaching conversations. He has this thing about input goals, and that's where I feel like so many of us struggle, is understanding the inputs, understanding the specific things that makes something do well. Now, this can apply to sermon stuff. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. It's going to apply to so many things, but there is power in iteration. Now, we did an online workshop, I think back in November, maybe October, where I taught my Creating Invitational Culture workshop on Zoom for the first time. I've been teaching that all over Louisiana as part of my role as the Congregational Vitality Strategist, the Louisiana Conference United Methodist Church, to say that 5 times fast. But I've been teaching that. I think I counted, I've in person taught that workshop 12 times now. And I'll tell you what, I can do that workshop in my sleep now with no notes, and I've gotten the chance to do it so much. I've trimmed out so much fat, but I've also realized when the same questions kept coming up more and more and more, and realizing, okay, here's a place for some adaptation. This could be a little bit clearer, all these sorts of things. And so by the time I taught that workshop online on Zoom, I felt really comfortable with the content. In front of people, I loved that. But I realized doing it on Zoom is really, really different. And I'm going to teach that workshop a couple of more times in 2024 at least. And so it's okay, I've got the in-person idea of it down. Now, I learned a lot before I did the online version of it, but I still feel like I could learn some more, especially for that format. Now, here's the thing. I could have done that once and said, I'm never going to do it again. But I'm like, no, I know that the more times I do something, and the more I think critically about what worked and what didn't work, and taking the time to think about things afterwards, so many times what that means is that gut instinct you might have actually was true. What you did not know yet was the steps that it might take to bring to that place that you think through. Now, that's iteration. There's a question right here that I ask myself all the time. What could have made this thing better? And I ask that a lot now because I'm doing a lot of similar things with a lot of churches. And I ask myself, what can make this better? And for me, the lesson I have learned is always, Chad, make it simpler. Chad, make it simpler. Like we did a 2024 ministry planning workshop this past week. And when I kind of did my after action on it, I realized, Chad, you need to make this stuff simpler. Make this simpler. Make this simpler. That's one of the lessons that iteration is teaching me is, Chad, make it simpler, make it simpler, make it simpler. And here's the thing. The more important the thing you're trying to do is, the more times you probably need to do it in order for it to work. Think about that. How many times you've given up after one or two times with things? And what's difficult is we have to learn to scale our iteration sometimes, because what you don't want to do is bring out this, big, huge, massive ministry initiative or huge change or all this kind of stuff and try to do it at the level of impact that you think it's going to need to have. It's like you don't introduce like an organizational restructuring to your entire church at Charge Conference. Like that's not going to work off well. You have to think about, how can I scale this iteration? How can I have, a conversation with a handful of leaders in a way that I'm able to speak really clearly about this? And then what does it mean for us to do this in exploratory mode? And you're over and over and over. And every time you do it, you're just trying to make it incrementally better. And for me, I've learned that better means clearer and simpler. Now, your sermons. Now, think about this. I'm learning about sermon iteration. Sermons is a growing edge for me right now because the last year and a half, I've been preaching an entirely different context than I ever have in my ministry. I'm in front of 15 or 20 people. I have no visual aids, no screens, no nothing like that. And I'm also pretty dynamically, contextually different from the people. And so I've been spending so much time in the last year on my sermons, and I've gotten to the point to where, I've realized, okay, these are some of the places and the things where I can hone in on this. So let me find ways to identify this and begin working on this over and over. And so what I've learned sometimes is that means I might need to preach that sermon a handful of times for myself. I've not done that in years, and I find myself doing it. Also, what I'm doing is I'm sometimes preaching my first draft of the sermon into Pulpit AI. I'll record it, I'll upload it into that, and then I'll begin asking it questions and seeing, is it pulling out the same thing that I've been doing? Or I've been grabbing that transcription, taking the transcription from Pulpit AI, which is one of those best features. And I love using Pulpit AI for content creation post-sermon. But I'll take that transcript, drop it into Chat GPT, and I've have this thread where I've built out, these are the things I'm trying to work on. They're all really about transitions and about understandability, if that's even a word, that sort of stuff. And I'll take advantage of that so I can even iterate something like this inside of myself. And that sounds like a lot of work, but in my ministry context, a quarter-time, small, rural, local church pastor where I'm spending a very minimal but very strategic amount of time there, I need to be preaching well. And that's one way I can work on that regardless of where I am throughout the week, because I'm working on the road a lot now. So iteration is just something I have learned, and I keep asking myself always, how can this be better? What can the next version look like? And how can the next time I do something along these lines, how can it be, 5, 10% better? Just looking at that and realizing that's where just solid ministry programming is coming out of something that's been iterated well. The second thing I have learned is this: create time for what has you at your best. Now, this is like old school productive pastor stuff right here, but it's important. It's serious. What warms your heart? What warms you? And this is about working. For me, productivity, doing things in a healthy way, or is the kind of new rolling tagline for all of the work I do is healthy ministry through strategic productivity. For me, if I'm not doing two things, a lot of things are going to be janky. And those two things for me are reading and thinking. If I don't do this, the rest is really hard. And what I mean sometimes is I've learned I've got to carve out, 15, 20 minutes in the morning to get a chapter of a book down or a section of a more complicated book down. And then to take the time to kind of think through it and to write down some notes, maybe connect it to something else I've read. My devotional life falls into this because I get to think through Scripture as I journal, as I read, all these sorts of things. Because I'll tell you what, if I get the time to read well and think well early in the morning, the rest of the day is, significantly easier. I mean, my energy is absolutely right there. I'm able to kind of hit into what that 9 a.m. task has to look like, and I am already at my best and ready to roll for that. And so I've had to learn. I've got to defend that time. I've got to, make sure I'm waking up early enough to do that. Also, I'm realizing that sometimes if I'm not able to get up as early as I would like to, that it's worth more me having the time to do that well and start, work, or I'm doing quotes, unquotes right now, doing work a little bit later than I would like to start, but to be doing better work when I start rather than having some hard, 8 o'clock in the morning or 8:30 a.m. start time and it be really crummy for 2 or 3 hours. I've learned, that creating the time for what has me at my best is super important. And I learned what was for me, that reading and thinking through Clifton Strengths. Clifton Strengths is going to help you at least start evaluating what these things look like and help you to understand some behaviors that you might have when you identify what's a good day, what's a bad day, what's good work look like, vice versa, all these sorts of things. And I know that this reading and thinking lines up with multiple of my strengths inside of my Clifton Top 10. So, you're looking for some things to add on to next year, like what you might want to do, dive into Clifton Strengths. Contact, a certified Clifton coach. I'm one of those now. Get a couple of sessions with them to make sure you really understand your profile and you're able to begin working